Hi and welcome to This Week in Travel, brought to you by Turning Left for Less. I'm Michelle Robson, editor of Turning Left for Less. This week we'll be looking at topical news stories as well as Barbados. How do you get there on miles and points? How do you use your points in hotels? And what are the things that you need to know before you go? I'll also be taking a quick look at British Airways tier points. How do you get them? Why do you need them? And what do you get when you reach a certain level in the British Airways Executive Club scheme? And finally, is it actually worth it? This week in the news in travel, in the US, the Department of Justice has launched a bid to overturn a ruling from April 2021, which said that the CDC imposing masks on public transport was unlawful. Apparently this is because the EU are requesting that passengers from China wear masks inbound on flights to the EU. Apparently the US would like to do something similar, although they haven't ruled out potentially bringing in a blanket requirement for all passengers on US flights to wear masks. But this would only be brought in if there was a sudden surge in cases or a new variant. Let's hope that that doesn't happen. Also this week, if you're about to renew your passport, you'd better get a move on because prices are about to rise for the first time in 5 years. I mean, to be honest, it seems pretty expensive already, but definitely you need to get a move on because the new change comes in on the 2nd of February. It's actually only a small rise, which is good news. It goes from $75.50 to $82.50 for an online application. But obviously, if you're about to renew anyway, there's no point in delaying. It's also a good time of year to renew because most people tend to start looking around March time because of Easter holidays and summer holidays. So normally there's less waiting time at this time of year. It's also worth bearing in mind that if you renew your passport, you no longer get any time remaining on the initial passport added on. The reason for this is because the EU will no longer recognise any validity past 10 years on a passport, so that's to align with that. And finally, an interesting development at Tokyo Haneda. There's a new development due to open at the end of January, which is attached to Terminal 3. Not only does it have 2 hotels, one of which is luxury, it also has shops and restaurants, and the most interesting feature is a new spa. The spa has an open air terrace which has onsens on it, which are a bit like a hot tub but without any bubbles. There's a whole different range of thermal experiences, including a cold plunge pool as well as the warmer pools. It's not just open to hotel guests, but anyone can come in to the spa, including passengers from the airport. It's even open 24 hours a day. Personally, I love the sound of that. There's nothing like after a long flight, getting in the outdoor air and also having something like a shower or a bath really does help revive you. I'm a real fan of Singapore Changi Airport. I don't know if you're aware, but there's actually an outdoor pool area there that all passengers can use for a small fee, and that gets you a towel and a shower as well. So it's a great way to refresh in between flights. So I'd like to take a look at Barbados, which is one of my favourite Caribbean destinations. It's one of the most sophisticated islands in my experience, and it's not too expensive compared with other islands. It's quite an easy place to get to on miles, and it's also great for using points, which is unusual in the Caribbean because many places actually only have independent hotels, and the major chains can be few and far between depending on where you go. So let's have a look first at how you get there. There's a good range of flights from the UK that you could use points and miles on. There's Virgin Atlantic who fly from Heathrow that you could use your Virgin Red points or Flying Club points. There's British Airways that fly from London as well, direct, which you could obviously use Avios on. And there's also Aer Lingus who fly from Manchester direct to Barbados, which you could also use Avios on. If they're in your British Airways account, you can use them directly. You don't need to transfer them over to Aer Lingus. You can book direct from British Airways. If we look at hotels, Marriott is the best represented hotel group there, but there's also a Hilton on the south coast as well as a Radisson. Neither of these 2 hotels I'd particularly recommend. The Hilton's not too bad, but it's not what I would call a luxury Hilton. It's also worth considering where it is. There's 2 different tourist areas in Barbados, the south coast and the west coast. The south coast generally tends to be a bit rougher in terms of the sea, but I personally think the beaches are nicer. They have very white, fine sand, and the water is beautiful, crystal clear turquoise. On the west coast, the water is still pretty good, but the sand tends to be a bit coarser because there's a lot of coral reefs. If you like snorkeling, you're probably better off on the west coast, but if you like your fine white sand, then probably the south is better. It's worth bearing in mind that the West Coast is generally known as being calmer. However, when I went in December, it was actually pretty rough there, and apparently over the winter months it can get quite rough on the West Coast, whereas when I was on the south it was actually better, ironically. So if we have a look at the Marriott hotels, there's quite a number of them. One of them is the Courtyard, which I really wouldn't recommend if you're there on holiday. It's more of a business hotel in the capital of Bridgetown. The other group of hotels are part of Elegant Hotels that Marriott took over a few years ago. Most of them are all-inclusive, some are adult only, and some are just normal hotels with pay-as-you-go dining. So I've stayed at the Colony Club, which I really enjoyed. That one is not an all-inclusive. What I liked about that one is the swim-up rooms, which is something a little bit different. It had beautiful landscaping. It was a small resort and you were right on the beach, so everything was on one level generally. It's great for those that maybe have mobility issues because you don't need to worry about too many steps. And it was also quite handy in terms of location because it was right next door to the Coral Reef Club, which would actually be my luxury hotel of choice. So if you wanted to go and dine there, it's literally a couple of minutes walk, which is great. The other hotel I've stayed in from the group recently, which is all inclusive, is the Crystal Cove. Now this is really a beautiful resort. It's got multi-levels with several different pools, waterfalls and even a cave bar. The food was okay, particularly in the evening. I thought they did a decent standard in the non-buffet food, but I found the buffets a little bit uninspiring, particularly breakfast and lunch. So if you're a foodie, it's probably not the right place for you. However, it's worth bearing in mind you can do dine around on the Marriott Elegant hotels, but again, a lot of those tend to be buffets, so I did try it and I wasn't that impressed. However, the room there was reasonably modern and it was definitely well equipped, and I was lucky enough to get a great upgrade as a platinum, which is interesting because I actually didn't book direct, I booked through a travel agent. So technically I wasn't allowed any benefits, but they really went out of their way to greet me as a platinum and even came up to me in the bar one night and said, "Oh, we just wanted to say hello, we noticed you're a platinum." And they didn't know who I was either. Well, at least I don't think they did. So I thought that was really impressive. They said that they try and speak to all platinum members. So yeah, if you like a beautiful resort with a nice little beach, different pools, and a couple of restaurants to choose from, that's a really nice one. I also stayed at Waves. Now, I wasn't a fan of this one. Some people love it, but it really wasn't for me. However, I did think the food here was actually the best out of the all-inclusives. I really like the fact they have a coffee bar that does salads, wraps, sandwiches, that sort of thing at lunch. I don't always want a buffet or, you know, a la carte at lunchtime. Sometimes I just want a quick snack. So I really like that. And the evening meals were also very good. What I don't like about the hotel is the fact that it's on several different levels. So there's steps down to the beach, which if you're carrying stuff or you've got children's, not really ideal. And the beach doesn't actually lead onto the pool, which is unusual. So if you want to go from the beach to the pool, you've basically got to go up the steps and then through the bar, through reception and into the pool, which is not ideal. And that pool on the main side of the hotel, the beach side, is very small and it's quite shady because it's got walls around it to shield it from the road. So I wasn't keen on that one. There is another pool in the adults only side, but it's actually across a main road. So you've got to get across and there's no sort of specific crossing particularly there. So it's not ideal perhaps if you've got children. Generally the traffic will stop for you, but you know, when you're sitting by the pool you can hear the noise of the cars, which is not great. The other pool was really nice, and there's also a nice Asian restaurant on the other side in the adults only, but it wasn't really for me, and I thought the rooms were getting a little bit tired even though they on the surface look quite modern. Finally, I'd also recommend a couple of independent hotels, which are the Seabreeze, which is all-inclusive. That was my favourite all-inclusive out of any of them. There's also one I stayed in this year that's at the luxury end, which is the Bougainvillea Resort. That's on the south coast, and because it's next to Sandals, it's actually got one of the calmest beaches on the south coast, because Sandals actually built a kind of barrier which stops the waves being so rough there. So you get a really great beach, beautiful white sand. The rooms either come with a kitchenette or a full kitchen depending on what you book, which is great if you want to just, you know, have some breakfast or a bit of lunch without paying high prices. But there's a restaurant on site and a really nice Italian restaurant next door, so I really like that. The landscaping again was beautiful. There was beautiful pink bougainvillea everywhere, waterfalls, separate pools with sort of rocks around them. It really was lovely, and drink prices were great, especially during happy hour. You could get, you know, a couple of rum and cokes for about £7, which you definitely can't complain at that. So bougainvillea on the south coast is probably one of my favourites I've stayed in that's not too expensive. It's around about £250 a night. So what else do you need to know about Barbados? Just a couple of quick things about getting around. There's no Uber there. However, they do have something called Pickup, but it can be a bit tricky to get it to work on your phone if you don't have a local SIM. I use something called Airalo, which is an eSIM, which you can buy eSIMs from all around the world. It's a simple app to use. It's pretty cheap, around about $8 for 1 or 2 gigabytes. And that's generally enough if you're going to be in the hotel on Wi-Fi most of the time. So that's worth bearing in mind. And Pickup worked pretty well for me. It was very similar to Uber. Taxis can be quite expensive. When you come from the airport, they're cheap because they're actually regulated prices. So they do expect a bit of a tip there because they're a bit being done over, I think, by the government because they haven't put prices up for years. So I definitely get a taxi from the airport. I wouldn't bother getting a paid transfer. When you're getting about, what I tend to do is if I find a taxi driver I really like, I make sure I get their card. Taxis vary hugely. Some drivers are great, some have really horrible old cars, some have really nice new ones. So when you find one you like, then I tend to keep their card. If you're staying in a good hotel, generally they'll get good drivers, so that's worth bearing in mind. Other than that, the only thing to say is food is pretty expensive, so it's just worth considering what you want to do in terms of all-inclusive versus staying in a usual breakfast-only type of place. However, the good news is that alcohol is actually reasonably cheap in comparison. That's because the taxes there are quite low, so at least you can have a good drink. You just have to live on the cocktails. So that's all my tips from Barbados. If there's anything you particularly want to know, feel free to pop a comment below and I'll try and answer your questions. So I'm going to take a quick whiz through the British Airways Executive Club tier points, how to get them and whether it's worth it. So British Airways, you gain status in the Executive Club from earning tier points, as well as a set number of flights. The set number of flights is pretty low, it's only 4 for gold, for example. So the most important point is generally the tier points. You might think that that's also down to the number of flights, but actually it's more down to the type of flights that you take. So if we have a quick look, on short haul you would earn 40 tier points for a normal short haul one-way and business class. However, if you do a short haul plus, you get double that, 80 tier points. So if you're not quite sure where to fly on holiday or for a short break, it's worth considering what your options are. If you want some examples of where to go that get the extra tier points on short haul, pretty much all of Greece and Turkey and the Canary Islands are great options. There's also Malta, which I really like. I've been there a few times. And if you're a fan of White Lotus and watching Series 2 and falling in love with that beautiful scenery, then Catania and Sicily is a great option. The flight prices are normally pretty reasonable and it's about 40 minutes from Taormina where that series is actually filmed. So it's worth considering that. If you're interested, check out our article on Turning Left for Less on Catania tier point breaks. If we look at long haul, it's 140 tier points for a standard long haul flight one way. There are some longer routes like Singapore where it's 160, but they're pretty limited. In terms of getting your extra tier points, one of the top tips at the moment is British Airways holiday special offer. So it's valid until the end of the year. To do it, you have to have a flight and either a hotel or car hire for a minimum of 5 nights. You can have a longer holiday as long as within that you have 5 nights of car hire or hotels booked through British Airways Holidays, and that gets you double tier points, which I think is a great deal. Definitely worth considering to get status. It's also worth looking in terms of long haul at can you go in several segments. So Qatar is a good example. If you fly with them rather than British Airways to go to Singapore, you would get double tier points. That's because you stop in Doha. So London to Doha and then Doha, Singapore basically get you 140 tier points for each leg. So that's 560 tier points return, which is pretty good, almost all the way to silver, which is 600 tier points. If you're flying to the US on the West Coast, it's definitely worth looking at doing a stopover on the East Coast. I'd recommend New York because the flights from coast to coast from there are actually really good because they have proper business class with flatbeds, which is much more comfortable than the normal domestic recliner seats. If you're going to Hawaii, that's also worth looking at stopping off in New York on the way. And that gets you an extra 140 tier points for doing that. So again, it's similar to flying Qatar. The other thing worth bearing in mind with these type of things is when you do something called a transfer, that's basically a stopover of up to 24 hours, and that's free. It won't cost you any extra on most tickets. If you want to do a stopover, which is more than 24 hours, it can be quite expensive. It can be as much as £600. Sometimes it's only 75 to 100. It really depends on the airline and the rules of the fare, but it's always worth checking it out because actually breaking up the journey can be quite nice on something long like Hawaii. And you could go into New York to have a look around. You could stay at the TWA hotel that I'll be covering in a future episode, and it's really worth it if you're a bit of an aviation or history buff. It's a great hotel to visit. So if we look at each tier individually, for me, bronze it's okay because you get your seat selection 7 days out, but by then a lot of the seats have gone. So for me, it's not really worth bothering with trying to get it unless you're going to get there naturally or you're very close. Silver, I think, is a sweet spot if you fly economy quite a bit. If you fly business class, I honestly don't see the point because pretty much everything you get with silver, you get with business class. So you get club lounge access, you get your business class check-in, and you get your extra baggage. So it's a really useful tier to have because if you fly a lot in economy, you can use all those things when you're just flying normally in economy. The next one up, gold, has one really big perk for me, and that's not actually the lounge, it's the first class wing, which is at Heathrow. Obviously, if you fly from Manchester or one of the Scottish airports, it's not really that useful because actually you're just going to use the transfer most of the time, so you're never going to use it. But if you fly from Heathrow, that's a massive benefit for me. It's basically a first class check-in and a completely separate security wing that takes you through into the first class lounge and then onwards into the Concorde room. So that's a really good perk for me. I think my record is something like 6 minutes from curbside to sitting with a glass of something fizzy in my hand in the lounge. So you can't really beat that, can you? It's much better than the fast track queue. So yeah, gold gets you first class lounge access as well. Now this is a separate lounge to the Concorde room, which is actually for ticketed first class passengers, and separate to the club lounge for silver. I think it's much better. It does still tend to be very busy, a bit like the club lounge, but it does have better food. You get food that you can order and the champagne out to help yourself to, normally a selection of at least a couple, and the spirits is definitely better selection and cocktails as well from Mr. Lion, who's a well-known mixologist. So it's a nicer environment, but I wouldn't say it's so amazing that it's worth getting gold just for that personally. But it's, yeah, the one time I did drop down to silver, I will admit I did miss it a bit, but it's up to you, how much you'd use it. So it does get you some perks above flying in business class. It gets you that extra lounge in the first wing, which to me are worth it. I'll just quickly mention gold upgrade vouchers. Now these you don't get automatically with gold. You have to get up to 2,500 tier points, whereas to qualify with gold, it's only 1,500. The gold upgrades basically get you an upgrade by one class, and that includes from club to first. For 2 people is the first one you get at 2,500, and that's either on cash or Avios, so it's a really useful perk to have. I use mine a lot, so if you generally get quite close to 2,500, it could be worth considering, is there a way you could maximise one of your trips to actually get to that 2,500 to get the actual vouchers. The final tier is not actually a tier technically, and it's not really advertised as such by British Airways. That's gold guest list. Now this takes a lot of flying. I can tell you I did it 1 year because I wanted to get it once, because once you qualify, now you can re-qualify for less. So it's 5,000 to qualify and only 3,000 to re-qualify, which is a lot easier to achieve. It gets you access to the Concorde room, which is for first class passengers, and that really is a cut above the other lounges. Has a proper restaurant, I'd say, rather than dining area with waiter service. It has the Laurent Perrier Grand Siècle champagne, which is really very good. And it does have a better range of spirits and cocktails, and I think it's the peace and quiet that I like, and the fact that if you go in there a lot, because it's much smaller, they tend to recognise you, and that's really nice. The gold guest list phone line's also a big perk for me. You rarely have to wait very long, and you do get really good agents that can also help you with BA holidays, which for me was always a sticking point on gold, as trying to speak to someone in the holidays department. So that's a big perk as well. You also get something referred to as a joker, which is a space release, and that allows you to release seats on Avios even when they don't exist, providing a certain fare bucket is available. You can release up to 5 seats on a flight, providing nobody else has them. So that's a great perk, I think, from the Gold Guest List tier. So that's kind of a whiz through British Airways tier points and how to get them and the different tiers. Personally, I think, as I said, silver is a great one to have. The one thing it saves you in terms of money, other than lounge access, that I didn't touch on before, that I'll just go into, is the seat booking fee. So normally to book Club World with British Airways can be up over £100 per seat just to choose your seat, which is pretty crazy. Whereas with silver, you can book from when you actually make the booking, so you should get a good choice of seat. Gold, you also get that free, but there are some seats actually reserved just for gold card holders until online check-in, and that's the first row of Club Europe, for example. And also you get free access to exit row seats, which is a big perk if you fly in economy. Hopefully that's given you an overview of all the perks that you can get with British Airways status and how to get tier points. If you've got any questions, feel free to stick them in the comments below and we'll try and answer them for you. So that's all for this week in travel. If you didn't catch our first episode, which was a celebrity special, that's still available on YouTube now. In it, I talked to Jonathan Samuels, a reporter from Sky News, Andy Peters, the TV presenter, and Paul Charles from the PC Agency. I'll also be doing an in-depth interview with Jonathan Samuels about his time reporting, which will be out in 2 weeks' time. There's some interesting stories about flying into war zones and hurricanes and military aircraft that are really quite something different that certainly most normal flyers won't get to experience. So make sure you tune in for that in the first week of February. And until next week, happy travels.